The Great Hall of Nexus Prime had not seen so many species gathered in one place for 3,000 years. Crystal walls stretched upward into darkness, and soft lights floated through the air like living stars. Representatives from 700 worlds filled the chamber, their bodies ranging from towering giants of living stone to delicate creatures made of pure light. Some breathed gases that would kill others instantly, so they sat within shimmering bubbles of their home atmospheres. Some communicated through colors that rippled across their skin, while others spoke in sounds too low or too high for most ears to hear. Translation devices hummed constantly, turning all their words into something everyone could understand. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog. Every being in that chamber knew why they had come. Every being knew what was coming for them all. Elder of the Stone Singers called the assembly to order. His voice rumbled like distant thunder, and the translation devices carried his words to every corner of the vast space. "We have confirmed the reports," he said. "The swarm has returned. 12 systems have gone dark in the past 30 cycles. We have received no communications from any of them. Our scouts have found only empty worlds and debris fields where fleets once stood." A wave of distress rippled through the assembly. Lights flickered and dimmed. Several delegates made sounds of pure anguish in their native languages. The swarm was supposed to be a myth. Parents told their children stories about the swarm to teach them the importance of cooperation and unity. Ancient records spoke of a time, thousands of years ago, when the swarm had swept through the galaxy like a plague of locusts. It consumed everything in its path. Entire civilizations had vanished overnight. The great powers of that age had united barely, and had driven the swarm into the void between galaxies. Most believed it had died out there in the empty dark. Most had been wrong. Ambassador and of the hegemony rose to address the assembly. Her serpentine body coiled around itself as she spoke, her scales shifting through shades of deep blue and purple. They were one of the oldest and most powerful species in the conclave. Their fleets numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their technology could reshape planets. "We have run every simulation," she said. "We have consulted every database. We have analyzed every scrap of data from the fallen systems." She paused, and her scales faded to gray. "There is no scenario in which we win a direct confrontation with the swarm. Their numbers are too great. Their adaptability is too rapid. For every ship we destroy, they produce 10 more. For every weapon we deploy, they develop a counter within hours." Silence fell over the assembly, not the silence of peace, but the silence of despair. "Our only option," and continued, "is strategic withdrawal. We must abandon the outer galactic arms and consolidate our forces in the core systems. This will mean sacrificing 300 billion sentient beings who cannot be evacuated in time. It will mean giving up worlds that have been home to our peoples but it will buy us time. Perhaps centuries, perhaps only decades, but time is all we have left." She lowered her head. "I call for a vote." Delegates began signaling their agreement. Lights blinked in patterns of assent. Voices murmured acceptance. What choice did they have? The great powers had spoken. The simulations had been run. Mathematics did not lie. The vote was moments from passing when a small light began blinking at one of the far platforms. A request for recognition. The senior delegates frowned. The platform belonged to a species that had only achieved interstellar travel 47 years ago. They held a single star system. Their fleet consisted of perhaps 60 vessels, laughable by galactic standards. They had been granted observer status as a courtesy, a way of welcoming them to the galactic community. They had never spoken in a full assembly before. Elder almost ignored the request, but protocol demanded that all voices be heard, even the smallest. "The assembly recognizes the human delegation," he said, his tone suggesting he expected nothing of consequence. Ambassador Wei stood. She was small by galactic standards, barely 2 meters tall, wrapped in a simple gray uniform. She had no bioluminescent displays, no color-shifting scales, no aura of ancient power. She looked to most of the assembly like something fragile and temporary, a creature whose species would be a footnote in history, consumed by the swarm like so many others before them. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes and sensors and perception organs of beings who had mastered the stars, while her ancestors were still discovering fire. "We will fight," she said. The translation devices hummed, the words spread through the chamber, and then there was silence. Not the silence of despair this time, the silence of confusion, of disbelief. Several delegates made sounds that their species used to express bewilderment, others simply stared. And scales flickered with irritation. "Ambassador, we appreciate your courage, truly, but you must understand the mathematics of the situation. Your species possesses 63 combat-capable vessels. The swarm's vanguard alone numbers in the millions. Your contribution, while noble in spirit, would not alter the outcome by any measurable degree." Wei did not flinch. "I understand the mathematics," she said. "I am also aware that the corridor lies directly in the swarm's projected path. The is behind that corridor. 17 billion who have never known war, who have devoted their civilization to art and philosophy and beauty. They will not be evacuated in time under your plan." A soft sound came from across the chamber. The delegate, a willowy creature with skin like mother of pearl, had pressed delicate hands to its face. Its people had no military, no weapons. They had not fought a war in 20,000 years. "That is regrettable," and said, "but we cannot save everyone. They themselves understand this. They have already begun preparing their people for what is to come." Wei nodded slowly. "And what does that preparation look like? Teaching their children that the universe has abandoned them, telling their elders that their lives were worthwhile, even though no one will remember them, writing final messages to be scattered into space, hoping someone might find them someday." "Ambassador, please, we do not have time for emotional appeals." "No," Wei agreed. "We do not have time, which is why we will fight." She pressed a control on her platform, and a holographic display appeared above the assembly. It showed a map of the corridor, with human fleet positions marked in blue. "We have already begun deployment. Our fleet will hold the corridor while they evacuate. We do not expect to survive. We do not expect to win, but we will give them time. Every hour we hold is another transport that escapes. Every day we stand is another million lives saved." Elder leaned forward, his stone features shifting with something that might have been surprise. "You would sacrifice your entire fleet, your best soldiers, for a species you have known for less than a generation." Wei looked at him steadily. "Yes." "Why?" The question hung in the air. The assembly waited. "Because someone has to," Wei said. "Because we cannot look at 17 billion people and tell them that mathematics has decided they are acceptable losses. Because the calculations say we will lose, but calculations cannot measure everything that matters." She paused. "Where I come from, we have a saying. When the strong protect the weak, everyone becomes stronger. When we abandon each other, we all become weaker, even those who survive." And Scales had gone very still. "And if your fleet falls, if your sacrifice buys only days?" "Then we will have bought days," Wei said, "and perhaps those days will mean something. Perhaps another species will see what we did and decide to stand as well. Perhaps the swarm will learn that not everyone runs. Perhaps nothing will change at all, and we will simply die in the dark between stars." She straightened her shoulders. "But we will not die having done nothing. We will not die with the words acceptable losses on our lips." The assembly was utterly silent. Wei looked around the chamber one final time. "We are not asking for your help. We are not asking for your ships or your weapons or your soldiers. We know what we are. We know what you see when you look at us. Small, weak, brief. A species that has barely learned to walk among the stars." She smiled, and there was something fierce in it, something that several of the older delegates recognized from species long dead. Species that had fought and fallen against the swarm 3,000 years ago. species that had refused to accept the mathematics of despair. "But we will fight," she said. "And when we fall, at least we'll remember. At least someone will know that in the darkest hour there were those who did not look away." She sat down. The vote for withdrawal was never called. The 63 ships of the human fleet arrived in the corridor 4 days later. They arranged themselves in a defensive formation across the main approach vectors, their hulls gleaming dully in the light of distant stars. Compared to the vessels of the great powers, they were primitive things. Simple metal and composite materials, basic shield generators, weapons that would have been considered outdated by galactic standards a century ago. Admiral James stood on the bridge of the flagship, the UNS Defiance. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and calm eyes that had seen too much death already. He had fought in the resource wars on Earth, had watched cities burn and friends die. He had hoped, when humanity finally reached the stars, that they might leave such things behind. Instead, they had found something worse waiting for them. "Admiral," his tactical officer said, "long-range sensors are detecting the swarm's vanguard. They will reach the corridor in approximately 18 hours. Nodded fleet status. All ships report combat ready. Ammunition stores are full. Shield generators at maximum capacity. Crew morale is—" The officer hesitated. "Hi, sir. Everyone knows what we are here to do." Through the main, could see the distant glow of a beautiful blue-green jewel hanging in the void. 17 billion souls who had never known war. Artists and poets and dreamers who had built a civilization devoted to creating beauty rather than destroying it. They had welcomed humanity with open arms when the first human ships had stumbled into their system, lost and confused. They had shared their music and their stories and their gentle wisdom. Now they were running. Evacuation ships launched from the surface every few minutes, carrying as many as they could hold. But there were not enough ships. There was not enough time. Without someone to hold the corridor, the swarm would fall upon them before even a fraction could escape. "Send a message to all ships," said. "Tell them I am proud to serve alongside them. Tell them that what we do here matters no matter how it ends. Tell them," he paused, "tell them that the galaxy is watching. Let us show them who we are." The message went out, and across 63 ships, men and women who had never expected to be heroes prepared to fight and die for strangers. The galaxy watched. The great powers who had written them off as insignificant, the ancient civilizations who measured time in, the young species who were still learning what it meant to walk among the stars. All of them watched as the tiny human fleet took its position. And the galaxy held its breath. The swarm arrived 18 hours later, exactly as predicted. They came out of hyperspace like a living cloud, millions of bioships moving in perfect coordination. Each vessel was grown rather than built, its hull made of organic compounds harder than steel. Each vessel carried weapons that had evolved over millions of years, designed by nature to destroy anything they encountered. The swarm did not negotiate. It did not communicate. It simply consumed. Long-range sensors could not even count them all. The tactical displays showed only a wall of red, stretching across the entire width of the corridor. Behind that wall, somewhere in the heart of the swarm, were the queen nodes that controlled everything. Vast organic computers that processed information from billions of individual units and coordinated them into a single, devastating whole. Admiral looked at the display for a long moment. "So many," he murmured. "Sir," his tactical officer asked. "Nothing," he straightened. "All ships prepare to engage. Remember your training, remember why we are here, and remember that every minute we hold is another transport that escapes." The human fleet surged forward. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a storm, a hurricane of fire and death and desperate courage. Human ships dove into the swarm's formation like wolves into a flock of deadly birds. They did not fight the way galactic doctrine prescribed. They did not maintain careful formations or protect their flanks or retreat when losses mounted. They fought like humans had always fought when their backs were against the wall, with fury and creativity and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. When their missiles ran out, they switched to close-range weapons. When their weapons overheated, they vented the heat directly into enemy ships that had gotten too close. When their shields failed, they used their ship's own mass as battering rams. The swarm's predictive algorithms, honed over millions of years of consuming civilizations, could not model what was happening. They expected prey to flee or surrender. They did not expect prey to become predators. The first day cost humanity 17 ships, but the corridor held. The second day cost them 12 more, but the corridor held. By the third day, the swarm had begun to adapt. Its tactics shifted. It stopped trying to simply overwhelm the human positions and began targeting specific weaknesses. Ships that were damaged, ships that were isolated, ships whose crews were exhausted. Admiral watched his fleet shrinking hour by hour. 34 ships, 28, 22. The faces of captains he had known for years disappeared from the communication displays, one by one. Each loss was a knife in his heart. But the evacuation transports kept launching. Every hour, thousands more escaped. Every hour, the sacrifice meant something. On the fifth day, the UNS Resilience, commanded by Captain Maria Santos, found herself surrounded. Her engines were damaged. Her weapons were nearly depleted. 3 swarm cruisers were closing in for the kill. "Admiral," she said over the comm, her voice calm, "I'm going to try something." "Maria, no. Tell my family I love them." She cut the comm and aimed her ship directly at the largest swarm cruiser. Her reactor was already set to overload. When she hit, the explosion took out not only that cruiser but 6 others nearby. For a few precious minutes, it opened a gap in the swarm's formation. A gap that 3 damaged human ships used to escape and regroup. Stories like this repeated throughout the battle. Crews who knew they were doomed choosing to make their deaths count. Engineers who stayed behind to keep engines running just a few minutes longer. Medics who refused evacuation because there were still wounded who needed them. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy could not understand. Why do they not run? The hive mind asked itself. Why do they not surrender? They know they cannot win. The question had no answer. The swarm's vast intelligence could analyze the composition of human ships, the capabilities of human weapons, the psychology of human crews as revealed by their communications. But it could not analyze the fire that burned in human hearts. It could not model hope. It could not calculate courage. By the 7th day, the human fleet had been reduced to 23 ships. Admiral had not slept in over 100 hours. His uniform was stained with sweat and coffee. His eyes were red and burning. But the evacuation was 70% complete. 12 billion people who would have died were now safely away, heading for worlds deep in the galactic core. "Sir," the tactical officer said, wonder in his voice, "we are receiving a transmission from, sir, it is from the hegemony." Frowned, "Put it through." Ambassador N's face appeared on the screen. Her scales were a deep, steady gold, a color, had learned, that displayed only when they felt profound respect. "Admiral," she said, "I am contacting you to inform you that the 3rd Fleet is en route to your position. They will arrive in 6 hours. Stared, "You are sending reinforcements." "We are," she paused. "We watched your people die, Admiral. We watched them fight with everything they had for a species they barely knew. We watched them refuse to run, refuse to surrender, refuse to accept that mathematics had sealed their fate." Her voice wavered slightly. "We were wrong. The calculations did not account for what you are, what you have shown us." "I do not understand," said. And scales brightened. "We are not the only ones. The stone singers are mobilizing. The light weavers have pledged their fastest ships. The consortium of free worlds is gathering a combined fleet. Your ambassador, Wei, she has been speaking to the conclave. She has been showing them what you have done here." She leaned forward. You asked us to remember. You asked us to know that in the darkest hour there were those who did not look away. We remember, Admiral, and now we are coming to stand with you." For the first time in 7 days, Admiral allowed himself to hope. "Hold the line," and said, "Help is coming, the galaxy is waking up." The transmission ended. Looked around his bridge, at the exhausted, battered crew who had given everything they had, at the displays showing the swarm still pressing in from all sides, at the blue-green glow of the still visible in the distance. "All ships," he said, his voice steady. "We hold for 6 more hours, 6 more hours, and we will not be alone." And somewhere in the vast spaces between stars, fleets began to move. Species that had not fought together in remembered old alliances. Rivals set aside ancient grudges. The mathematics of despair began to shift. Because the humans had shown them something they had forgotten, that the darkness could be resisted, that courage was not a function of probability, that sometimes the only way forward was through. The galaxy had held its breath, and now, finally, it began to exhale. 3 years had passed since the Battle of Corridor, 3 years of blood and fire and endless war. The galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Admiral Wei, the former ambassador, stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance, the third ship to bear that name. The first had been destroyed in the corridor. The second had fallen defending the system. This third Defiance was larger, more powerful, built with technology shared by a dozen different species who had once kept their secrets jealously guarded. Around her, the bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency. Human officers sat alongside and stone singers and beings made of pure light. 3 years ago, such cooperation would have been unthinkable. Now it was simply how things were done. Through the main, Wei could see the assembled fleet. Ships from 47 different species, arranged in a formation that human tacticians had designed and alien engineers had refined. Behind them, the last major stronghold of the Galactic Coalition. Ahead of them, the final swarm fleet. So much had been lost to reach this moment. The outer galactic arms had fallen. World after world had been consumed. Species whose names Wei could barely pronounce had been wiped from existence. The refugee fleets that fled the destruction were scattered across the core systems, billions of beings who had lost everything. And Earth was gone. Wei closed her eyes briefly, remembering. The decision had been the hardest of the war. The swarm's main force had been approaching Sol, humanity's home system. There was no way to stop them. The only option was to use Sol itself as a weapon, to detonate the star in a nova that would catch the swarm fleet in a sphere of nuclear fire. 8 billion people had been evacuated in the largest exodus in human history. But the planet that had given birth to their species, the world where their ancestors had taken their first steps, was now nothing but scattered atoms. Humanity had become a diaspora species, a people without a home. But they were still fighting. Admiral, the tactical officer, reported, "The swarm's core fleet is emerging from hyperspace. Estimated numbers." The officer paused. 700 million vessels, Admiral. The Queen nodes are with them." Wei nodded. They had known this was coming. For 3 years the coalition had been working toward this moment. Every battle, every sacrifice, every hard-won victory had been about buying time. Time to study the swarm. Time to find its weaknesses. Time to develop a plan that might, against all odds, actually work. The Queen nodes were the key. Kill them and the swarm would collapse. Its billions of bioships were merely extensions of those vast organic minds. Without the queens to coordinate them, they would become mindless, drifting, harmless. But the queens were protected by the largest concentration of swarm forces ever assembled. Getting to them would require fighting through 700 million ships. "Open a channel to the fleet," Wei said. The communication officer nodded. "Channel open, Admiral." Wei looked into the camera. knowing that her face would appear on across thousands of ships, to crews of dozens of different species. 3 years ago, she began, humanity asked the galaxy a question. We asked whether it was possible to resist the darkness, whether courage could matter against impossible odds, whether standing together was worth more than surviving alone. She paused. The galaxy answered, you answered. Species who had been strangers became allies, rivals became friends, and together we have done what no one believed possible. We have held the line. Through the swarm fleet was visible now, a dark cloud spreading across the stars. So many, so terrifyingly many. Today we face the final test. The swarm has gathered everything it has for this assault. If we fall here, there will be no second chance. The core systems will be consumed. Everything we have fought for will be lost. She straightened. But I do not believe we will fall. I believe that what we have built here, this coalition of unlikely allies, is stronger than anything the swarm has ever faced. Not because of our ships or our weapons, but because of what we have become. Separate, we were prey. Together, we are something else entirely. We are the answer to the darkness. She smiled, and there was something fierce in it. All ships prepare to engage. Today, we remind the universe what it means to stand together. Today, we end this. The channel closed. Admiral, the tactical officer, said, all ships report ready. Wei nodded. Execute Operation Final Dawn. The coalition fleet surged forward. The battle was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Not simply because of its scale, though the scale was enormous. Not simply because of the stakes, though the stakes were absolute, but because of what it represented. 47 species fighting as one, sharing information in real time, covering each other's weaknesses, sacrificing for strangers without hesitation. Human tactical doctrines guided the overall strategy, that relentless adaptability that had shocked the swarm in the corridor. Weapons technology provided the firepower. Stone Singer shields protected the flanks. Light Weaver communications kept every ship connected, a single vast organism moving with unified purpose. The swarm adapted as it always did. It probed for weaknesses, searched for patterns it could exploit. But the coalition adapted faster. Every time the swarm found an approach that worked, a new counter emerged. Not from any single species, but from the combination of all of them together. Hours passed. Casualties mounted on both sides. The void between stars filled with debris and bodies and the fading light of destroyed ships. But slowly, inexorably, the coalition advanced. The swarm's hive mind felt something it had never experienced before. Not fear exactly, for it was not capable of fear in the way that individual beings understood it, but something like uncertainty, something like doubt. How were they doing this? How were these disparate, conflicting, chaotic species working together so effectively? The swarm had studied them for years. It knew their weaknesses, their divisions, their ancient hatreds. It had expected them to fragment under pressure, to turn on each other, to revert to the selfishness that had always defined organic life. Instead, they had become something greater than the sum of their parts. The first Queen node fell 12 hours into the battle. A combined strike force, led by human ships and supported by heavy cruisers, had fought through the defensive screens and delivered killing blows to the massive organic computer. When it died, 100 million swarm ships simply stopped, their controlling intelligence gone. The second Queen node fell 4 hours later, then the third. But the remaining queens adapted. They pulled their defensive forces. They sacrificed outlying ships to protect their cores. They began to coordinate more directly, their separate minds linking into a single, desperate consciousness. Wei watched the tactical displays, reading the flow of the battle. They were winning. Slowly, painfully, at terrible cost, but winning. The question was whether they could finish it before their own forces were exhausted. Admiral, the sensor officer reported, the remaining Queen nodes are consolidating. They are forming a single defensive sphere. Wei studied the display. The queens were clustering together, surrounding themselves with the densest concentration of defenders the swarm could manage. It was a smart move. Breaking through would cost the coalition dearly. But it was also desperate. The queens were no longer trying to win. They were trying to survive. "Signal all ships," Wei said. "Prepare for final assault." The response came not in words but in action. Ships that had been holding defensive positions surged forward. Reserves that had been waiting for hours threw themselves into the line. Species that had been strangers 3 years ago flew wing to wing, protecting each other, dying for each other. The assault on the Queen Node sphere lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of continuous combat, of ships exploding and crews dying, and the void filling with fire. 9 hours in which the coalition threw everything it had against the swarm's last defense. When the final Queen Node fell silent, it was not a dramatic moment. There was no great explosion, no triumphant fanfare. The vast organic mind simply stopped, and with it, the billions of remaining swarm ships stopped as well. They drifted, purposeless, harmless. The greatest threat the galaxy had ever known ended not with a bang, but with a whisper. Wei stood on her bridge, staring at the tactical display. At the red icons that had represented the swarm, now all gray. At the blue and green and gold icons of the coalition fleet, battered but still flying. "Admiral," the communication officer said, voice shaking, "we are receiving transmissions from across the fleet. They are cheering, Admiral." Wei listened. She could hear it through the open channels. Voices raised in joy and relief and disbelief. Songs of victory. Stone singer rumbles of satisfaction. Human laughter and tears. She smiled and felt tears on her own cheeks. They had won. Against all odds, against all mathematics, against the darkness itself, they had won. In the aftermath, the galaxy struggled to understand what had happened. Historians would spend centuries analyzing the war, trying to identify the turning points, the key decisions, the factors that had made the difference. Military theorists would study the tactics. Philosophers would debate the meaning. But for those who had been there, who had fought and bled and lost friends in the long night, the answer was simpler. They had stood together. When every calculation said they should run, they had stayed. When every model said they should fail, they had refused to accept it. When the darkness came, they had not looked away. 3 months after the final battle, the conclave of 700 worlds, now called the Coalition, met to discuss the future. There were empty seats in the Great Hall, species that had been wiped out, civilizations that existed now only in memory. The cost of victory had been beyond calculation. But there was hope, too, hope that had not existed 3 years ago. Ambassador Wei, still wearing her admiral's uniform, addressed the assembly. "You have asked what humanity wants in return for our role in the war. You have offered us worlds, resources, positions of leadership, power." She shook her head. "We do not want power, we never did. What we want is simple, a place at the table, a voice in the decisions that affect us all, the chance to help build something worth protecting." She paused and a small smile crossed her face. "And if you have it, some help finding a new, we miss having a place to call our own. Somewhere with oceans, maybe. We miss oceans." Laughter rippled through the assembly. Warm laughter. The laughter of friends who had been through the fire together. Elder, speaking for the stone singers, rose. "There is a world in the system. It has oceans. It has land. It has been held in reserve for a species deemed worthy by the Coalition." His stone face shifted into something that might have been a smile. "We can think of none more worthy than humanity." The chamber erupted in agreement. Colors rippled across scales. Lights blazed from the light weavers. Every species, in their own way, expressed their assent. Wei bowed her head, overcome. On the new human, which they named Hope, a memorial was built for those who had fallen in the war. At its center stood a simple stone, bearing words written in every language of every species that had fought alongside humanity. The words had been composed by a philosopher, the same people humanity had first died to protect in the corridor. They read. They were small and fragile, and their lives were brief as starlight. But when the darkness came, they did not look away. They did not ask if victory was possible. They asked only where they were needed. And in asking that question, they taught an ancient galaxy how to hope again. Around that memorial, on every anniversary of the war's end, representatives of every coalition species gathered. They shared stories of the friends they had lost. They renewed their bonds of alliance, and they remembered what they had learned in the darkest hours. That courage matters. That standing together makes everyone stronger. That the universe belongs not to the strongest or the longest lived, but to those who refuse to abandon each other. The galaxy had held its breath for 3 long years. And when it finally exhaled, the breath was one of gratitude and wonder and the beginning of something new.